Hello and welcome to this special edition of the SBC podcast, where my guest and I are going to be talking about the profiling and tracking that bookmakers increasingly oversee over those of us that bet these days. With concerns over how this data is used and possibly abused, we are also going to explore some of the tools available to you, including VPNs, proxy servers, and virtual machines. We'll also get into some of the best practices when it comes to things like bank accounts, deposits, and withdrawals options. To discuss all of this and more, I'm pleased to welcome to the pod Neel Shah, somebody who knows a lot more about some of these topics than I do, especially from a tech point of view. Welcome to the pod, Neel. How are you?
Yeah, very good, Pete. Yeah, and thank you for having me on the show.
Well, it's a pleasure because this is a really interesting topic. There's a lot of information on social media, especially about some of the things we're going to discuss. But first of all, how best should we introduce you? You're a mixture of a writer, bettor, tipster, and also working inside the bookmaking industry these days.
Yeah, bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. I used to be a teacher. I used to work in mental health, and then kind of turned my hand to betting full time. This would have been a couple of years ago, and yeah, I've been writing articles for a few different websites. I'm a kind of regular on TradeMate as well. I've kind of done a bit of work for them, and I've joined the dark side, joined the industry this year as well. So, a mix of different things, really.
Yeah, so exactly. You do a lot, and therefore you're in this position whereby it's important to understand some of the things we're going to talk about today, how bookmakers profile people, how you can get bets on, these kind of concerns that so many people have. And I think it's only fair as well to credit, you were on a podcast or video cast as well with Alex Vella from TradeMate Sports, and you talked about some of these things we're going to go into today. We'll probably go into a little bit more detail as well today, but it's worth a good credit to Alex for pioneering this. I think it was like earlier in 2022, what you did with him?
For early this year.
Yeah. Because, of course, these kind of topics when it comes to bookmaker data, it evolves. It's a bit of an arms race as well between punter and bookmaker too. One bookmaker might introduce something or change certain aspects of their website or prevent bots or whatever scrapers using their service. So it's always an arms race between... So technology moves along quite quickly, isn't it? So bear with that in mind if you're listening to this. We're trying to point you in the direction of what we found out and what we know. But, if you're listening to this 6 plus 12 months down the line, there could be probably will be a few different elements to consider, won't there?
Absolutely, yeah. Like you say, it's kind of constantly evolving space. Things that were the case a few years ago have changed, and there's kind of constant evolution. But I think part of the advantage from a punter side is there are always solutions. There are solutions to most of the issues out there if you look hard enough. And again, with changes in one direction, opens up opportunities in others as well. So yeah, absolutely. So a year from now, hopefully there'll still be some sort of relevant information. There's some kind of evergreen things that still apply, but it's very fast moving space.
It is, yeah. And I want to preempt this conversation by talking about multi-accounting, the elephant in the room. And I know it's very important, very popular, with multi-accounting, with account closures and restrictions. So more and more people are doing this, whether it be betting in their partners or brothers' names or whatever it might be. We're not going to tell you how to do that in this episode. If you wish to multi-account, good luck to you. There's an element of risk in that, especially given it goes against bookmaker T&Cs. This episode is more about informing you on the data bookmakers collect, concerns over how that is used, and some of the tech options available to you as a sharp punter that you might wish to use. And I want to kick off by talking about why bookmaker data and the tracking has been in the news in recent times. There was an article in the New York Times earlier this year, and then the Financial Times more recently. There's one firm, and I don't want to make it about one firm, that complaint has been logged with the ICO about the data that this particular bookmaking company, a big one, is collecting. They're alleging widespread illegality in how they operate and abuse of that data. And I'll slide those articles in the show notes. But the concern is that this one firm, it's the thin end of the wedge, and that all bookmakers are using the rich amount of data, like hundreds and hundreds of data points, as we'll get onto, to profile gamblers and then possibly share it with dozens of third parties who then target them. So not only might this, allow them to target winners, but losers, and basically use your data against you or being sold. And some of the concern, we'll talk about this and get into some of the detail, but some of the requests that come up when you visit a bookmaker's website are very concerning these days, aren't they, Neel?
Yeah, they are, absolutely. I think it's part of a kind of wider issue with how our data is collected online. And I suppose the assumptions we make and perhaps sort of what we're unaware of, actually goes on behind the scenes. So, when you do go on a website and you get that little pop-up, that asks you, to kind of accept all cookies. I think if a lot of people were aware of what data is collected in the background when you click that button, they might be more reluctant to do so. And it was particularly in relation to betting companies, because they are a unique case. The way that bookmakers will use this information, it will be quite different to how a company like Facebook, for example, might want to target their customers. So it does open up a really interesting debate about what data we can expect to be used, and also raise questions about why certain data is actually needed and why it's beneficial for us as a consumer, or at least at the very least unharmful.
Because bookmakers are obviously, there's a lot of complaints about people having delays, withdrawals, lots of extra checks. So the concern is that some of this data that they're using is being used and possibly abused in terms of not paying punters out or asking for additional documents to make life difficult. And when you look at the failure of the regulator to enforce fairness across the industry, punters are often left high and dry, trying to get access to their money. Throw in a topic like single customer view as well. Now, that's up, I think it's a sandbox. It's in development. The Gambling Commission are driving this through as best they can. It's flawed. If you want to listen to single customer view debate, I've did some podcasts with Neel Shah and Andrew Woodman. We talked about it in depth. But effectively, it's just a way whereby bookmakers can see how much you've deposited or lost and bet with all legalized firms. So, you open an account of Ladbrokes, you lose $2,000. They say you can't bet anymore. You just go to William Hill and deposit with them, and they wouldn't necessarily know what you've lost with Ladbrokes. In this case, single customer view would enable it. It's a flawed concept, but it all boils down to the fact that, can you trust bookmakers? And with the data, can you trust them to be fair? And I think it's only right to say, no, we can't at the moment, can we?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of reservations, there's a lot of concerns, and I suppose you just have to look at it logically in terms of how a bookmaker would operate and what kind of information is useful to them. And you'd have to question whether the industry as a whole, if it's able to police itself and able to only use that data for positive reasons. For example, identifying genuine problem gamblers, vulnerable gamblers who are at risk, and not resisting that temptation to actually take advantage of that data and profile profitable customers, close down winning accounts, and in general use the rules in place to their advantage.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And let's talk about some of the things that we've collected. There's some software called Fiddler. I believe that you've showed me, you've run it prior to this call, and we talked about it, that enables you to find out how much data that bookmakers track about you. Talk me through what Fiddler tells you and what some of the things that you found you using their software.
Sure. So Fiddler, I'm not a super techie person. I just kind of, these things have kind of become a necessity, and I kind of learn as I go along. But it's basically like a debugging tool. So what it does, it kind of shows you the web requests that are being made whenever you open a website. Whenever you're kind of clicking through on different links, it will kind of show you what's kind of pinging to and from your browser. And so what's quite revealing, and you could definitely try this yourself at home, is trying different bookmaker websites and seeing what kind of requests come through. And sometimes it can be quite surprising. So, for example, I don't know, one particular bookmaker, I'm happy to name them if you like, Pete, or we could just keep it as one example.
I think we'll keep it as one example just because I think it's industry-wide, isn't it, this issue? It's not just one particular rogue firm.
No, I don't think there's anyone who's necessarily behaving any better or worse than anyone else. It's a general kind of issue with these rules. But yeah, going back to Fiddler, so once you log on, or even before you even attempt to log on, if you just kind of accept the cookies on the website, Fiddler is looking for things like, is there a request to Facebook, to Reddit, to Hulu, which is like a kind of Netflix streaming type service. Disney Plus was another one. All kinds of things, and it makes you wonder why exactly a bookmaker needs to know if I have a Hulu account or what I'm doing on Facebook. What's the purpose of knowing what I'm posting on Facebook for them? What does that have to do with what I want to bet on? And how is that information actually being used? So you can kind of play around with Fiddler, and again, change different browser settings and modes, incognito modes or private modes, use different browsers, and you'll start to see what kind of information gets collected on you, and what kind of things you might be able to avoid being tracked on your device as well. But so that's something we'll get onto as well, is that there are pros and cons, to masking as much data as possible. So it's really a balance between what you want to achieve if you actually want to get bets on and have an account that's running, and how comfortable or uncomfortable you feel with the amount of data that's being shared.
Yeah, exactly. Because why would a bookmaker need to know? You sent me a screenshot like Amazon and
Amazon as well,
TikTok and Discord, and so they learn so much about each individual person. They're building up quite a big overview of the customer, the bettor, and the profile of that particular customer, aren't they? It seems so strange that so much data is required by a bookmaker and that the user doesn't realise.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to clarify as well that none of those sites were open. So I didn't, which I could understand if I had Amazon open or something else, but I just opened a browser, a guest profile, so it had no history or anything, and just went straight to a bookmaker website, and then all of these requests came through. And it does beg the question that what is this data being used for? And then again, why is it necessary? And perhaps this is something, a wider point on the internet in general, whenever you do, log on anywhere, this kind of data retrieval for data retrieval's sake. Perhaps in a lot of uses, it's not actually used for any particular purpose. It's just kind of mined there as part of the process. But again, the lack of transparency around why it's used is definitely something to be of concern.
I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of people being more aware about data and how it's being used. And I was reading an article about how Apple have kneecapped Meta, Facebook's advertising business, because they introduced anti-tracking software. So I don't have an iPhone, but apparently now you can be filling with, do you want to be tracked prompt? And therefore most people are saying no. Therefore Facebook, which is an advertising company, can't actually advertise to people like they might do who have iPhones. And apparently that change alone is worth 10 billion, or in terms of how much it would knock off its annual revenue. So, it's so important these days. And I think there is a growing kind of nature for people to be more mindful of how their data is being used. And it's one thing, how many times you go to a website, accept cookies, but what are you accepting? And it's, maybe one thing if you're searching in Amazon for a book, or I was searching for some gym equipment the other day, and then lo and behold, everything I look at is sponsored advertisement for gym equipment, which is fine, because I found something cheaper and I don't mind that. But it's all altogether different when it comes to betting and money, doesn't it? And that ties into some perhaps how it's being used with credit unions and places like that to, again, further profile people and how much they can bet and if they want to accept those bets. So let's talk about that, the credit unions, because I was chatting to someone recently who said that they were blocked by one firm. I said, I'm going to name them, but they deposited £200 that went through, and then they put £60 in, the second amount, and immediately got an email saying, no, it's banned because of, I think it's TransUnion, the credit agency, and there was no right to reply. That was it. They were just, we don't want your customer anymore.
Yeah, it's a huge concern. And the bookmaker in question, again, worked with TransUnion and also a few other companies. I believe Klarna is one of them who people are familiar with, who do the kind of buy now, pay later type thing. I've got my my Xbox through that scheme as well. But then that again raises the question that the bookmaker is able to see a person's credit history, credit score, debt history, and can make judgment calls on whether they're likely to be a profitable customer for them without the express permission of the customer, and kind of buried in the terms and conditions of a lot of the bookmakers, and this one in particular is essentially if you don't feel comfortable with all this data being shared, then we advise maybe just close your account, but they'll still have data on file once you've opened it, so there isn't really a recourse to it. And even trying to request information through the GDPR Act and actually getting this information from the bookmaker and asking them to delete all of this can be quite a cumbersome challenge. And there is still data that they will have on you for money laundering purposes, for example, that will still remain in their systems for 5 years, even if you don't want to be opted into any marketing emails, for example. They will still have that data, but they're not acting on it, but it's still stored somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah, it's it's another question, another topic for another day. Obviously, if people can delete that and how that data is checked, and that's why the Information Commissioner's Office this suggestion that there's some illegality going on that they've been asked to investigate. I asked actually about this particular case that was in the Financial Times about if it's proceeding. It's still with them. I think the ICO is overwhelmed because of so many issues with data these days and how it's handled and GDPR and all this kind of stuff. So who knows how long that will take? But it needs to be, hopefully we'll raise awareness of it. And we also want to talk about when these checks are made, because when you open an account, it seems to be that's probably a key point when checks are made, possibly when trigger limits are hit. I know withdrawals, it's like, so if you certain winnings thresholds and withdrawal stage, and that's probably why we're seeing so many issues with withdrawal. Of course, obviously, they can delay it as well. But, Bookmaker wants, well, this person's won X amount of us. We just want to check whether we can find some loopholes possibly to stop paying them out, or there's some issues with all this data we've collected. Because, if they've got data like about your Facebook and your Twitter or your YouTube, and it doesn't necessarily correlate with what you're telling them, then that possibly is a red flag in their eyes. And maybe there's other things as well. So would you say they're the three stages, the opening of an account, those trigger limits, and then at the withdrawal stage?
Oh, yeah, I would say those are definitely the three key times. I mean, the checks can be done kind of sporadically at any point, and it is sadly the case when the accounts go on an extensive winning run, these kind of checks could be coming, these kind of account locks or suspensions, pending further documents can also come. But yeah, absolutely, the point is, on account opening, these things are looked at, things are cross-referenced, the details are checked to see whether this is a genuine account, a genuine person, do they reside in that address, are they on the electoral roll, or, some other kind of database that can confirm their identity. And again, the deposit method itself, so all the bookmakers will have a fraud team that will look into some elements of that, although I suppose the checks on the payment side aren't necessarily that extensive when the money goes in, but become more so when the money is being requested to come out.
Funny that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it? So yeah, there's absolutely sort of key times where this stuff is looked at in the account. But even during the life cycle of the account, there's an interesting article which I'll definitely post up somewhere for you guys, on digital profiling in the online gambling industry, which was at the beginning of this year. And it did look at quite a few bookmakers and how sort of data was kind of shared across to third parties during account use. So they had accounts that had been running for several years. So, one example of an account here, I think, had been opened up over 10 years of the lifespan of the account, since 2009. And again, looked at, there were requests again made to the companies we mentioned, things like, to Google, to Facebook, and some websites were able to see how much you'd actually deposited in, details such as your username, some of your other personal details on there, your activity, and again, all of this without the customer's knowledge, and over a long sustained period of time. And again, we all know, bookmakers will kind of periodically review accounts in terms of, if they're profitable, if they're winning, if they need to be restricted, or, if they're, so unprofitable, actually, they could raise the stakes for the customer. But it is concerning, sort of the amount and the depth of information that's shared with third parties that the customers aren't aware of, and how transparency is very lacking on that. So even when asked and requested, so how many data requests were made, for example, for a customer, they may have said, let's say 4, but actually, once in receipt of the data, there were 7 or 8 requests there. So there's a mismatch between what the data providers are actually reporting and what's actually shown on these systems and what the evidence actually shows. So it's very, very insightful to see how this kind of stuff is exploited.
Yeah, it seems to be, the exploited is the right word. There's a lack of clarity and there's a lack of governance, I suppose, and regulation on this. People are aware of the issues with the Gambling Commission, whether it be things like Football Index or how the increase in complaints about people not being able to withdraw money in a timely fashion. But we see with the ICO, again, another overwhelmed government agency, unable to protect people or make sure things are clear and fair, and that information is not being abused, especially when it comes to financial situations like, betting and, because the temptation is there, and we're not saying any firms particularly doing it, but the temptation must be there to abuse that data, whether that be to remove winners or properly bookmakers profit when punters lose. So the insinuation would be some firms might wish to utilize it for that on that basis to find those people that maybe don't lose a huge amount, as per the concerns about affordability, etc. But enough because the betting industry works on a lot of punters losing small amounts of money. That's generally how it works and how it's ticked over. So also want to talk then about what we can do, what tools we might have. And you mentioned as well, you briefly referenced like if you used incognito mode, I think you spoke to, but that's, if you use some kind of privacy tool, incognito mode is what most people will be familiar with. Google Chrome, you can select it for private browsing. But if you start, or, perhaps you could have some software on your computer that prevents access to some of these trackers. But I believe certain bookmaker websites don't even load if you don't enable the tracking software to actually work. Is that right? Some don't even load, and then even if they do load, it might raise questions. So what have you got to hide?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some websites, but that just you'll have trouble logging in or registering, depositing again, because I suppose you need to provide a kind of minimum cookies or data for them to verify you're not a robot trying to log in and you're an authentic human user. I'm sure, some of you have probably seen those sort of endless little puzzle things where you have to, find the cat and the penguin that's upside down and,
I had a duck today. Yeah, I had a duck.
Okay, yeah. So these kind of things, again, are trying to prevent fraud. So the key thing is looking at it from the bookmaker's perspective and point of view is that, they want to have genuine users, not people who are kind of abusing free bet offers for opening accounts or sharp punters who are opening up accounts and, again, multi-accounting and in different people's names. So the more you try to disguise what you're doing, the more it might flag you up as someone who, might be either shrewd with technology. And I say that loosely because, again, this is relatively simple things that people can do. And it probably worked in the past. I imagine. I think I did things like this and using incognito mode or private mode and bookmakers weren't really looking into it. But I think, those days are probably not long gone, but, you're more limited in what you can do with that. So you need to give something away in a sense, to try and make a bookmaker feel safe and secure that you are a genuine customer, a winning customer for them, and behave in a way that most normal punters would do, going on, kind of logging in, not kind of taking lots of extra steps and, making an account. There's lots of other factors that go into it, not necessarily just the privacy mode. Obviously, the time of the you might open an account, when you might do it, for example. But yeah, you could kind of experiment with different kinds of browsers. Some sites.
Would you say some browsers are better than others than Chrome, which is the most popular one, I imagine?
I think there's different kind of pros and cons to it. So, for example, there is a browser called Brave, which kind of prides itself on the privacy settings and the kind of security that you have with that browser. But again, some bookmakers will block that browser altogether. So, and that there may be more in the future that will do that too. You also want to factor in the browser you're using on the device. So, for example, on an Apple device, using Safari rather than Chrome certainly has some advantages that won't go into too much on here, but you may be able to see Apple kind of releasing lots of features all the time. For example, like private relay, which can be quite beneficial for again trying to stay under the radar. It's just kind of just bearing in mind not necessarily just the browser you use, but also kind of how well you've cleaned your device or how much kind of clutter is on your computer or your phone already. And again, balancing sort of having absolutely nothing to profile you with having far too much that you perhaps don't want to give away.
Yeah.
So it's worth kind of playing around, with all the different browsers. Some bookmakers, they work better than others. But again, you can kind of test that as you go along.
This is all from the perspective of a sharp bettor, someone that's winning who wants to appear like they don't know what they're doing. So you effectively want to look like an average punter. You don't want to look technically proficient compared to, you want to look like the casual guy who's going to chuck a bunch of cash on an acca and lose it. Your average Joe, somebody who doesn't necessarily read information about or listen to a podcast like this, or follow tipsters or whatever strategy they might have, which might enable them to win. So it's better to have like what you might term an internet footprint that looks normal than to have a disguised or a private mode browsing experience. you're better to just try and blend in, aren't you? And try and think and act just an everyday person who's not particularly tech savvy and not particularly betting savvy. Would that be the right way to term it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of it is kind of absurd that you have to have this level of subterfuge just to get bets on. But this is where we're at the moment, and yeah, you have to. Everything you approach in this way is to try to see it from the bookmaker perspective. What kind of customer do they want, and try to behave in a manner that kind of befits that. So even if you do, you get your account open and you've got it there, and it may not be the best idea to, if you found an ARB on like Kazakhstan second division, to put on that straight away on your account. So in the same way, bearing in mind sort of how you open up the account, the kind of deposit methods you use. There may be deposit methods that are advantageous or easier for you to do.
Give me a few, Neel, while we're on it. We're going to talk about this. Let's talk about what deposit methods you would suggest.
Yeah, so obviously there might be different methods depending on the bookmaker, but there's Google Pay, Apple Pay, PaySafe. There's Trustly. There's a few others. You can transfer by bank directly, PayPal, Skrill, you name it. There's kind of this huge range of payment methods. But what do most normal people deposit into an account with? It would be a debit card, so you might have access to these other payment methods, or have some floating around in your PayPal, for example. But but again, like opening an account in a normal kind of manner that a normal punter would do, they would use their bank card. They would use a simple debit card.
Just to intervene there, because I believe like Skrill, for example, is one of those accounts where it would raise red flags from a bookmaker because of its extensive usage by people who are perhaps taking advantage of bonuses or match betting. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that certainly could be. I mean, the reason I'm aware of, I suppose, is that a lot of bettors from the Asian subcontinent, from India and Bangladesh, and from Eastern Europe use Skrill, or syndicates have been known to use Skrill as deposit methods.
Right.
That's why perhaps some bookmakers are on the lookout for certain types of payment method that are commonly used. But that certainly could be the case as well. So
there's pros and cons. So if you start, you're better off, much better off just using this. Again, goes back to just think like a normal person using a debit card or from a high street bank as well. So
yeah, I was going to say that. So again, with a debit card, there's so many different banks around now, lots of online banks as well. But as well as it kind of not flagging something with the bookmaker, you also have to bear in mind with all the legislation coming through, and I'm seeing things on Twitter, I can't verify for sure, but there are some banks who are not as keen on gambling transactions, and I have heard stories of people having accounts blocked or gambling transactions just kind of outright refused, and it causing issues. But again, you're generally better off with a high street bank with a kind of profile there, because obviously your payments are more likely to go through and you're less likely to have issues. Not to say you can't use other banks, but like we said, try and set yourself up as normal as possible.
Yeah. And would it impact the speed of withdrawal as well? Is there a faster withdrawal method or an easier, less friction, where somebody might ask for more documentation if there's something concerning?
Yeah, so there are different payment methods, Visa and MasterCard, with the two of them. Generally, Visa payments are faster, particularly if you have a Visa Direct card, be able to get your money the same day or within, with a few hours. So that's something perhaps people aren't aware of, that, eventually you'll still get your money back. But if you have the choice between waiting the same day or waiting a week sometimes, which could happen with MasterCard withdrawals, it's sort of well worth considering that. If, for example, you wanted to open up a second bank account just for your betting, that might be worth considering.
So Visa Direct being a good method in a high street bank versus, like a Barclays or Santander and NatWest versus a Monzo or Starling or those kind of more recent online only banks. And I guess as well, it goes to, if you just open a bank account and then immediately just start doing a whole bunch of betting transactions and that's it, it's more likely to flag than if you have an existing bank account that you've used for just everyday stuff, and then you start to put some betting activity through it. It's less likely to be an issue. Because, I have read about the same kind of thing online of people having some issues on that front with certain accounts not being happy with betting activity. So just something to bear in mind. Again, the situation might change, but just think logically, I suppose, and just think like what the bank would want. Do they necessarily want somebody that is just betting in their bank account? Probably not. It comes with a bunch of risk, and they just look at it and think, well, this guy's going to be losing money. And betting does have a natural or it has a historical association with crime, whether it be money laundering or whether it be gangs or whatever, because of the nature of the business, I suppose. And it's times when it was illegal or has been illegal in certain countries too. So it's just certain things to consider there. That concludes this episode, which is part 1 of our special take on bookmaker profiling and the data they collect. Part 2, which is episode 46, will be out next week on the 28th of November. And you'll be able to download that when it's released by subscribing to the Smart Betting Club podcast feed. In part 2, we'll be taking a deep dive into some of the options available to you as a smart punter, including a look at virtual private networks and servers, also known as VPNs and VPSs, as well as virtual machines and other tools and techniques to consider to protect your information.